to, got a lot of things going here. Welcome to Understanding Trauma in Foster Care. This is a huge topic, so we'll kind of touch on several other mini topics throughout. My name's Jennifer Danford. I am a foster parent trainer with KBC. I mostly work in Topeka, Lawrence, Hiawatha, kind of those areas. I've been with KBC for about a year. And prior to that, I have a lot of experience as a caseworker. Most of it's in Missouri, so a little bit different, but I've been working in this field almost 20 years now. So, been working with foster parents for a long time in different capacities. I know what you guys do can be a big challenge. So, I do appreciate you guys coming to these trainings and continuing your education. Um, Understanding trauma and foster care, you guys know why this is important. We talk about it in our map classes when we get started, because all the kids who come into your homes have experienced trauma at some point. And so um, it's good to kind of talk about how that can affect how we parent and those kind of things. So we'll talk about those as we move forward. If you guys have questions, thoughts, concerns, those kind of things, feel free to unmute yourself throughout the presentation and ask questions. I'm glad to answer those, or ask in the chat. I usually am able to see that as well. Also, I know it's dinner time. Feel free, if you guys need to be eating or grab something, that's fine as well. Children's Alliance does want your cameras on, so if you can have those on, that would be really helpful. But again, I know that you might need to be eating or doing some things that would be kind of informal, so that's fine. Okay, so tonight, a couple things I want to make sure we get to. Identifying trauma, what it looks like in kids and youth, and maybe talk about some brain research a little bit. Understanding how addressing some of these kids with trauma behaviors might look a little different than how we address their peers because of the trauma. And then look at how trauma kind of affects us throughout our lifetime, and some of the after effects of trauma that our kids may end up suffering. So there's a couple quotes about trauma that are kind of powerful. Let's see here. Okay, so it's easy to assume that babies don't remember trauma because they obviously express their experiences differently. But at 8 to 12 weeks of age, babies have stored enough memories that they start to anticipate their caregiver's behavior based on previous behaviors. So, um, they'll lean in if it's their mother who's been a primary caregiver, who's given them food and has cuddled with them. But if it's a stranger, they may not lean in. So babies do have a survival instinct, and if they've been traumatized by someone, they already have that survival instinct inside of them to anticipate some of that. So that tells us right there that even though they're nonverbal, they can store traumatic memories, and that affects their behavior as young as 8 to 12 weeks. That's very, very young. And I know you guys know that. We even know that hormones and those kind of things in utero can affect babies. But trauma in infancy can have a lingering effect throughout life. So even if you guys get a child in your home who is, significantly young, maybe even a baby, you have to consider that they may have experienced trauma that might affect their behaviors, even if they came to your home fairly quickly. So what is trauma? Trauma is the response. It's an emotional response to an intense event or that threatens or causes harm. So it's not the actual event, because trauma is different for everybody. So, what, may be traumatic for you may not be for me. So it's actually that response. So this harm can be physical, emotional, real, or perceived. Um, if if it's hard for you to imagine like a perceived um, harm, think about bullying at school. Nothing is really happening, maybe, but there's that perceived harm, and that can be traumatic to a child. Or even domestic violence, where in a family home, um, the perpetrator, maybe the father, is threatening a child on a regular basis, but maybe isn't laying hands on the child, but maybe they lay hands on someone else. So perceived harm can be a very traumatic experience as well. We all are pretty aware that trauma can be the result of a one-time event, or it can result from exposure to multiple events. So a car crash can be significantly traumatic to someone. And that's a one-time thing, or multiple events over time is typically more likely. That would be something that our kids in care would have happened to them. So physical abuse usually wouldn't be a one-time thing. It could be, but typically it would be over time. Maybe sexual abuse, neglect. It takes time for those things to come out usually, and it's happened over and over. There are so many different possible sources of trauma, but here's just kind of a list. We know that the removal from the home, even though, the courts have decided that's the best thing for the child, is traumatic because the child is changing their entire environment, regardless of being removed from danger. We know that, again, moving multiple times while in care can be traumatic because of the attachments, having the child to kind of try to figure out different home cultures. Those kind of things can be difficult and traumatic. Obviously, neglect, some of the effects of poverty can be traumatic. Any kind of home and community or domestic violence, witnessing violent crimes, car accidents, separation from siblings. Sometimes they won't take all the siblings into care, and they'll split them up, or sometimes the siblings can't be placed with each other due to safety issues. So those can be traumas. Any losses, whether that's death or incarceration, maybe, of a parent, can definitely be traumatic. Someone has a debilitating medical or psychiatric condition. If one of our kids has something like seizure disorder or diabetes, that can be traumatic to them. Or if they live in a home where they're the caretaker of someone like that, or even if they're not a caretaker, but they live in the home of someone who has a significant untreated psychiatric condition, live in a home with someone who's depressed or schizophrenic or something like that, that can be traumatic. Any sort of natural disasters. So, I want to give you kind of a background or where we're at with abuse and trauma. So, this is case investigations. This isn't kids that come into care. This is all of the case investigations, so the calls that go into CPS. So they investigate child abuse, and they investigate emotional, physical, sexual abuse, those kind of cases. 7% is emotional abuse. Those are the calls that come in: isolation, rejection, criticism. Physical abuse is 18%, sexual abuse is 10%. But we have an idea based on, surveys as adults, those kind of things, that up to 2/3 of child abuse cases don't even get reported. So we know there's a lot of kids out there who are suffering from trauma that continue to live in family systems that that aren't safe for the child. In terms of kids that do come into care, this is 5 years ago in 2018, but I think it's still a good marker for us. 60% were neglected. So this could be, not getting fed, not clean at school, the house is not habitable, these kind of things. 10% were physically abused and 7% were sexually abused. Um, I do, wonder about those numbers being a little low, but I think sometimes it's easier to probably prove neglect than some of the other ones, or we find out the other ones happened maybe later. Um, but we do know that more than 15% were victims of two or more maltreatment types. So now we're talking about kids who have significant trauma in at least two areas before they come into your home. So they come in because maybe the parents were have addiction or substance abuse issues, so they were neglecting the children because the money was all going towards drugs. So there was no food in the home. The home was a mess, and then maybe they had people hanging around who were not good people, and so either physical or sexual abuse happened also. And so we have cases like that all the time where it turns out that there were two or more kinds of abuse happening. In that case, there would be neglect and either physical or sexual abuse happening also. And so then we have to figure out, with those two traumas, how do we address more than one trauma with a child that we're placing into your home and having you parent as well. So talking about stress is helpful here because this gets to how a child kind of processes these events. So we do have normal levels of stress in our lives. There are 3 levels of stress. One is the positive. So this is normal stress and anxiety. It could be intense, but it resolves quickly. So say you were going to give a presentation at your job. You would prepare it, and then right before, you might get this surge of anxiety. You give your presentation, and afterwards your life would resume. That's a normal positive type of stress that gives us the boost that we need to kind of get things done. Tolerable stress is longer lasting stress. So this is triggered by things like a death in the family, a job loss, something that's pretty difficult to get through initially, but it's usually mitigated through a support system or healthy relationships. So you have a family member die, a mom or a grandmother. And it's really difficult because those things are. And so we struggle with it. We may not participate in outings with our friends. We may struggle at work. But over time, with our support system, we are able to kind of get back to our normal level of functioning. So you can kind of see on the side how the stress level goes with the little stoplight thing. So toxic is the kind of stress that's really not good for us. Toxic is intense, prolonged adversity without support. So this is kind of the abuse that happens with our kids. Something's happening over and over or once, but we don't have the capacity to deal with it. It could be sexual abuse, like with our children. They don't, because of the nature of the abuse, it's likely that it's secretive, so they don't have that mitigating factor of having a support system to help them through it. Instead, they're hiding it. And they're scared. And so it's just prolonged. When is it going to stop? There's no ending point, and it's very highly, stressful. So all of them start with the same kind of stress, but it's kind of how it resolves itself. Toxic stress can be really unhelpful in terms of development. Here's a quick 1.5 minute video on this.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, so yeah, they kind of mentioned how toxic stress can actually affect a growing brain. This slide is a little more scientific, so kind of hang in here with me, but here are some ways it can affect the brain. It affects the stress pathway, which dysregulates the HPA axis, which is really the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. And so there's a lot of studies about that axis, if you're interested. So when we're talking about a child who's had a lot of toxic stress, it can cause anxiety, depression, and impaired learning and memory. And we have a lot of kids who have those kind of symptoms in school or, in their lives. I mean, if it makes sense if we think about it when we're under stress, not even toxic stress, but under stress, that's times when we forget, we forget our keys or we forget our phone. We can't find things. Our brains are not working well. And that's exactly what's happening with our kids. So emotional processing and regulation. There could be decreased gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how important that is. An increased amygdala volume, and that leads to hypervigilance and less attentional control. So hypervigilance is, constantly being aware of your surroundings. It's being in survival mode instead of actually participating in the moment and being aware of things. Evaluation of reward. We have a decreased reward response. So there is kind of this difficulty in experiencing joy. I think I have a video in this presentation later that kind of shows how our kids' memories seem to be a little more selective. They a lot of times select the memories that are negative. And it's like, we do a lot of things with these kids that we have in our home a whole weekend, and then maybe on Sunday night they're like, we didn't do anything fun. This house is not fun. And you're like, we did though. We went to the park, we went to the pizza place. But it's like in their head they just remember the negative things. But there is some brain science behind this, and this is kind of part of it here. There's a video that will talk about it. And then they kind of talked about some of the connectivity issues, but essentially, when the brain doesn't connect with itself, it doesn't work as well. So they struggle to understand situational awareness and how to respond in those kind of areas. So I said I'd kind of get to the prefrontal cortex, but let me kind of run through this really quick. This is kind of a simplistic model, but it explains how our brain works, and how our kid's brain works. So there's kind of three areas that we're focused on. The first one is the red one. It's the kind of the brain stem, the lowest functioning area in the brain. A lot of times when our kids are in trauma or having a meltdown or tantruming or being re-triggered, they're in this brain stem survival state. And so trying to have a conversation with them or consequence them or any of those things is not efficient at this time because they are incapable of processing. So when they're in this state, what they're really thinking about is safety. They're just trying to find safety. And so the only way to soothe them when they're in this state is trying to create safety. So this is the time where you can, try to show them that they're safe, find a safe, quiet place for them, those kind of things. The blue one is the limbic system. It's kind of the mid part. It's an emotional state. It's mid-level functionality. So when they're in this state, they are thinking about connection. They really want connection. They're thinking about, am I loved? So the only way to soothe this is through connection. Again, they're not going to be receptive to things like consequences or full processes. So reminding them that you're there for them, those kind of things. The green one is where we want to get our kids. If you can meet the other areas where they are, they can kind of move up to this green area, and it happens with practice. So it's an executive state. This is the prefrontal. This is the one that said, if they have trauma and toxic stress, that it doesn't build as much. And so we have to spend time with kids helping them build this. This is why even when we raise our own kids, we talk to them about consequences. We have things like structure because we want to build this part of the brain. So when we're here, we can talk to the kids about things like consequences. What can I learn from this? They're a lot more receptive. So this is kind of where we want to get our kids. When they have experienced abuse and neglect, they lose some of that functioning in the prefrontal cortex, which we've talked about. And again, that prefrontal cortex is responsible for logic and reasoning. And so that's why we see those things go out the window when they're tantruming or, not able to talk to you or process something. This is a quick video about the brain and trauma. It's super interesting.
That half of all mental health problems begin in childhood before the age of 14. And one of the things we're looking at is how experiences of early adversity, such as domestic violence and maltreatment, can lead to changes in brain structure and function that can embed long-term vulnerability to mental health problems. It's something we're calling latent vulnerability. Those who had been exposed to maltreatment and domestic violence showed heightened patterns of activation in those brain regions related to threat vigilance and threat detection. And what was striking is that we see the same pattern in other studies done by other groups where they have looked at soldiers before and after combat. And that might help both the soldiers and the children function in those environments, but the difficulty is that it may also embed long-term vulnerability. We believe it is reversible. We know that many children who experience abuse and neglect and domestic violence have a resilient and positive outcome, and we expect that their brain will change and respond to positive emotional experiences such as social support and being in a secure and safe environment.
I think we're starting to learn that, and that's starting to be more accepted that it's not just soldiers who have, traumatic stress. It's other groups of people as well, but it's still something we're learning. So I wanted to kind of go into ACEs really quick because this is kind of a measurement for trauma in a way. ACEs are traumatic childhood or traumatic experiences in childhood and teenage years that actually put kids at risk for violence, chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance abuse later in adulthood. They are adverse childhood experiences. There's lots of research on this if you're interested. And these experiences interfere with a person's health, opportunities, and stability throughout their life time. I will kind of go over what the ACEs specifically are, but this is kind of a good picture of what it looks like. ACEs are kind of above with the tree, and here are some of the environments are below that create some of these experiences. So I will talk about the questionnaire. I think I might talk later about more what it is, but essentially what happened was I think it was maybe a health company or insurance company paired up with the CDC, and they did a survey with adults and asked them these questions I'm about to show you. And then they also asked these adults what kind of what kind of things they have happened in their adult lives, including like health problems, financial problems, any things like that. They had a huge sample. This happened years ago, and they were able to correlate some of the child traumatic events with some of the adult events that happened, and therefore showing that if you had certain traumas or an amount of traumas, you are more likely to have certain adult events. So we'll kind of talk about those later. So there's a questionnaire. You can find it online. I have it in my references as well. It's a 10 question questionnaire. This is a good thing to maybe take yourselves to see, what kind of trauma you have in your life. Also, I have some information about our kids and what it looks like for them. So there's kind of one trauma for each question. For example, the first question, did a parent or other adult in the household ever or often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? That one would link with like emotional abuse. So you get a point. Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? That would be physical abuse. That's a point. Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way? Again, that's sexual abuse. That's 1 point. So there's kind of every question kind of goes with some sort of trauma. There's questions about neglect. Even having a divorce in your family can be traumatizing. That's a question. Domestic violence is one. If someone was in your home was a alcoholic or addict is one. If one of your parents was had mental health issues or attempted suicide is one. And then if a household member actually was incarcerated is also one. So out of 10, if you had however many points you had would be kind of your ACEs score. So let me give you kind of a baseline about ACEs. 51% of children in care have 4 or more ACEs, as compared to 13% of their peers. So that's a pretty significant difference there. And we'll talk about 4 or more here in a minute. 20% of foster parents actually reported having 4 or more, as compared to 12% of their peers. So also another interesting thing to kind of consider. That's, kind of a significant difference as well. Just kind of basic ACEs results. They're fairly common. It's trauma, and so we know that it's possible that trauma can be fairly common. So 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported they at least had 1 ACE before the age of 18, and 1 in 6 reported that they had 4. So we know here's where it's kind of tied to certain things. If we can prevent ACEs, we could potentially reduce many health conditions, up to 1.9 million heart disease cases and 21 million depression cases could be potentially avoided. We know that some children are actually greater risk than others. Women in several racial ethnic minority groups actually have more ACEs than others. And we know that the ACEs are costly. It causes our communities and families and society hundreds of billions of dollars each year in insurance costs, loss of work, services, those kind of things. So 1 in 6 have 4 or more. According to the CDC, 5 out of 10 of the leading causes of death are actually associated with ACEs. Children who have 4 or more, and remember, in foster care, that's 61%, have 12 times the odds of negative health outcomes. Study shows that female, younger adults, sexual minorities, and multiracial individuals are at greater risk. Respondents who have experienced in any single category of ACEs are 87% more likely to have experienced other forms of trauma. So if you have one, it's likely that you'll have another. So here's kind of some more ties with some of those outcomes. If you have 4 or more ACEs without intervention, you could be over 5 times more likely to be depressed, almost 3 times more likely to smoke, 2.5 times more likely to develop chronic pulmonary lung disease, and over 3 times more likely to binge drink. So there are some outcomes here that are pretty significant. And if we, I know we can't prevent these ACEs. We do have some preventative services before the kids come into care, but by the time they come into your home, they've already likely had the trauma. So then we just have to do things like address the trauma. So I'll talk about that later, and we can actually mitigate some of the outcomes. I do want to talk about this Kansas study really quick because it shows the ACEs of the kids that are coming into our homes. So there was a study done to actually look at ACEs and how that impacted placement. Almost 3,000 kids ages 6 to 18 in Kansas foster system between October 2015 and July 2019. So they did this ACE questionnaire with their caseworker when they came into care. The questions are a little different. It's not the 10 basic, but I have it listed out. I think they have like 19 things. So, disaster, accident, personal hospitalization, physical abuse, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, neighborhood violence, foster care, and physical neglect are the first page. Everyone obviously has foster care, but this is this page here, almost every category has 50%. Only disaster and accident have less. Physical neglect has 75%. of our kids who come into care had that one. 50% have intimate partner violence. So a lot of our kids are seeing their parents or adults in their home have domestic violence. 50% are coming in with some sort of sexual abuse. 60% are coming in with physical abuse. So we have a lot of traumas there. The next page, bullied, parental mental health or substance abuse, emotional abuse, parental loss or incarceration, medical neglect, abandonment, inadequate housing, parental incapacity, other trauma, or termination of parental rights. So parental loss or incarceration, we actually have 55%. That's a pretty significant trauma. Emotional abuse, almost 50. Mental health or substance abuse issues shouldn't be too surprising, but that's at 70%. A lot of our kids have those issues coming in. So it's kind of just an idea of what we're looking at with our kids in Kansas and the traumas that they are likely to kind of come into your homes with already. So foster kids in trauma. Among foster kids, care youth who receive 5 different placements, 90% get involved with the criminal justice system. That is a statistic that's not ideal, obviously. By age 17, over 50% of foster children will have an encounter with the juvenile legal system through arrest, conviction, or detention. 25% of our kids in care will be involved with the criminal legal system within 2 years of leaving foster care. And studies suggest that among kids in care, up to 80% exhibit serious behavioral or mental health problems. I think some of these numbers are getting better because we know we have to address some of these trauma issues. I think the longer kids are in care and the more placements they have, the more likely it is that some of these outcomes happen for sure. So some reasons for some of these extreme behaviors and placement moves, not only do changes in their circumstances cause them to constantly be adjusting to different environments, constantly having to adapt like that can actually impair their development. So every time a child is uprooted and moves to a new foster home, this development can regress 6 months. So it may not look like that. It could be, their school development's fine, their physical development's fine, but it could be their emotional development that's lacking, or it could be their school development that's behind. So in some way, though, usually something in their development does regress. So if we're talking about a child that moves from their home to a foster home, and then that foster home's a short-term placement, and then they move to another foster home for 6 months, and then they move to yours, that's that's 3 or 4 moves that can really set them back in terms of emotional growth or school growth or any of that. So then that's hard. Then we start seeing behaviors because they're trying to adapt and we're not seeing the progress. So some of these disrupted attachments can cause our kids to be hypervigilant. And hypervigilance, it can come out like noncompliance or defiance, or an inability to bond with the foster parent. When they're in survival mode, sometimes their behaviors can look like, they're not following rules and are not listening to you when they're in that brainstem kind of situation, which is not helpful because, you're just trying to have the structure in your home or whatever. It's kind of this catch-22 thing. We know that trauma impacts attachment. Their attachment may not have been good at home. It may have been overly attached. We don't know. But then we know they do have insecure attachment patterns because the people they were attached to or weren't aren't in their lives anymore. So should they attach to you? They don't know. And attachment's super important for kids. It's kind of the foundation of their social growth throughout life. Sometimes we see reactive aggression towards authority figures and peers, and that happens at school, or that could even happen towards you. They have difficulty empathizing with others' feelings, and that's really hard for us to see. We don't know how to address that. And then we have boundary issues. And those are really hard too. So I'm just going to kind of go through some signs of trauma, but I think it's really hard. We kind of just have to know that maybe our child might be having some behaviors related to trauma, because these behaviors I'm going to list could be a sign of a lot of things. So sometimes you just have to put your detective hat on and put 2 and 2 together. So in younger children, irritability or fussiness, if they startle easily, or you can't calm them over time, frequent tantrums, clinginess, reluctance to explore the world, activity levels that are different, higher or lower than their peers. If they repeat traumatic events over and over in dramatic play or conversation, or delays in reaching physical language or other milestones. So when we think about young children, if they're placed in our home, I think the thing to remember is we may not know all the trauma that did occur, because a lot of times they're nonverbal, or they're just beginning to be verbal. And so sometimes if we see these signs, that can be a sign that there is a trauma that we don't know about, or that something is kind of resurfacing. I do think if you watch their play, that is a really good way to kind of see if a trauma is impacting their life, because they will reenact it over and over in play. And we'll talk about some of the things you guys can do to address this if you think that trauma is impacting the life of a child in your home. School age, can't pay attention at school, quiet and withdrawn, frequent tears and sadness, talking about scary feelings and ideas. They can't transition from one activity to the next, maybe fighting with peers or adults. Sudden changes in school performance, wanting to be left alone, eating more or less than peers, getting in trouble at your house or at school. A lot of times our kids, when they are having trauma or it's being re-traumatized, they'll have somatic issues like headaches or stomach aches, but there's not a cause to that. And then they might regress in their behaviors. So have behaviors common to younger children, like wetting the bed or talking in baby voices, those kind of things. In teens, they talk about the trauma constantly, or maybe they deny that it even happened. They may not follow rules. They may talk back a lot. Sleep is a big thing, being tired all the time, or sleeping more or less than peers. Nightmares happen, taking, risky behaviors, or being impulsive, fighting, isolation, not wanting to spend time with friends, using drugs or alcohol, running away from home, or getting in trouble with the law. So here's the video that I kind of talked about earlier about how our kids' brains are actually changed from trauma.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones, and everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Okay, I'm going to talk quickly about some parental strategies and some parental systems. There are really 4 different parental systems: how we parent: authoritative, neglectful, permissive, and authoritarian. Excuse me. So, authoritative is if we have high structure and high expectations. Neglectful is There's no real structure or involvement. Permissive is high involvement but low structure. Permissive would be kind of like best friend parenting. Authoritarian is structure and demands but little involvement or responsiveness. So really we want the first one to happen. That's the most beneficial, is having high expectations and high structure. Neglectful is the most harmful, not being involved at all as a parent. Authoritative parenting is driven by responsiveness, involvement, structure, and warmth, which is also factors in positive parenting. Here's kind of just another chart of how that looks. Permissive is kind of you don't want your child to be mad at you, so you kind of give in. Uninvolved, this is kind of absent parenting. Just the child is there to fend for themselves, and the authoritarian is someone who is in charge. I'm gonna, I set the rules. We're not gonna talk about it, that kind of thing. So might be good to kind of figure out how you guys function as parents. Here's a couple parenting tips for trauma, and then I will kind of go into actual interventions. But being honest and direct with your teen or youth when talking about sensitive subjects, such as drugs, drinking, smoking, and sex. Meet and get to know your teen or youth's friends. That's helpful. Showing interest in their school life, and helping them to make healthy choices, and encouraging them to make their own decisions. So when you talk to your youth about their concerns, pay attention to changes in their behaviors, showing interest in their school and extracurricular interest. Kids who are involved in extracurricular activities do better. It's kind of based on where you live and how much of this isn't available, but sometimes there's community activities as well, theater, those kind of things. But having a support system and being involved in activities does mitigate some of the effects of trauma. Encouraging them to volunteer and become involved in civic activities. Making sure you're letting them know that you do celebrate their efforts and accomplishments. I think we do this, but after watching that last video, we have to be very intentional about how we do it, because a lot of times they don't hear our acknowledgments of them or don't remember that we acknowledge them. So sometimes having it be a very intentional moment so that they can store away that positive memory. Showing affection and spending time doing things you both enjoy. So I'm going to kind of get into the intervention part of this, because we know when we do have interventions for our kids who have trauma, they're less likely to have some of those outcomes that are associated with the ACEs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care because it's a framework that has been proven to kind of work. So trauma-informed care is really understanding how trauma impacts our kids' lives, how it changes their needs, and how it impacts the services they will require. It replaces the question of what's wrong with you to, what happened to you. So a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed, usually trauma-informed is an agency, a community center, those kind of things. They realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the path for recovery. They recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, but also in family, staff, and others, involved in treating these kids. Respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into their policies, procedures, and practice. And then they really seek actively to resist any re-traumatization. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the 6 key principles, but trauma-informed organizations should have all of these principles. Safety throughout their organization, having trustworthiness and transparency, peer support and mutual self-help should be available, being able to collaborate, empowerment, voice, and choice, so making sure that people within the organization are heard. And then also being aware of cultural, historical, and gender issues, being aware and also being responsive to those. So KBC also did a study. I didn't know this, but when I was researching for this, they did a study on trauma-informed care and how it could potentially affect the kids we work with. So kids who are 6 and older who entered KBC, who were removed from their caregivers and placed under our jurisdiction between 2011 and 2014, 1,500 kids basically were involved in this study. It's called Bridging the Way Home. You can find information on this in the KBC website. So basically they incorporated trauma-informed care into practice. It was intensive. They trained a lot of people. They trained workers, therapists, foster parents about trauma. So they provided training to nearly 85% of staff and 70% of 397 foster parents. So training and tools, translated trauma knowledge into the daily care of kids. So basically, we wanted it to encompass everything, how we interacted with kids on a daily level. So they used this trauma systems therapy was the framework they used within the trauma-informed care. It recognizes trauma as a barrier to the kid's self-regulation system, right? So if we are traumatized or have trauma, we can't self-soothe ourselves. We can't calm ourselves down when we get really worked up. We stay in these moments. So we have to address this self-regulation before children can recognize and deal with trauma through behavior or through therapy methods such as cognitive behavioral therapy. So it assumes that triggers in children's environment causing this this lack of self-regulation, this fight, flight, or freeze, should be reduced or neutralized to foster a feeling of safety in kids. So that doesn't mean like forever. It just means until they can start self-regulating. So if a trigger for a child is, I don't know, being told no, we find a different way to, tell a child they can't do something. We kind of reduce that trigger as much as we can until they can start regulating, and then we can kind of reintroduce that. So that's kind of what they did in some ways. But they also, they trained everybody in how to help the child self-regulate, all of those things. So they did several things. They described the process of integrating trauma-informed practice through our system. They examined the association between the implementation of that TST that we just talked about by members of the care teams and also by placement. And they looked at placement stability and well-being. So they wanted to see the association of those two things. Examined the extent to which the implementation of the trauma-informed care by those who work closely with the child. So they wanted some qualitative data as well. And then they hypothesized that the more TST, which is what we were just talking about, that trauma systems therapy, the more that they had that, the better improvement they would have in well-being and the less they would move around. So it was more likely they would stay in one home. So they did see increases after they had more TST, they had significantly greater improvements in functioning and behavior regulation. It was significantly associated with greater placement stability. And they did find that when, I'm not going to read all this, but essentially it worked better when the entire team was trained. So when a kid worked with a team, and everybody on the team was trained, including the therapist, case member, foster parent, everybody. That was when it worked the best. So reliance on any one member of the team would not be sustainable long term. And then they found that implementing interventions with non-clinical staff shows promise. So if we train our caseworkers in trauma, which we do, and if we train you guys in trauma, we train everybody in how to kind of address this, then we have a better chance of actually mitigating some of these possible things that could happen with our kids, these outcomes that come from having a lot of trauma. So that study is kind of helpful. Here is kind of our interventions and what we can do to address trauma in kids. We can identify these trauma triggers, which I just talked about. Could be something you're saying, something harmless in your home to you, maybe like a smell, maybe like holidays even. Holidays are traumas for kids a lot of times. You can't reduce a holiday, obviously, but you can be aware of it and kind of figure out what is helpful. So I'm not an advocate of making those triggers go away forever. I don't think that helps the child. It's not sustainable because once they leave your home, those triggers are right there. But if you can help them avoid those situations until they can build that self-regulation system, that can mean a lot. So if you can be working on those two things at once, that can help. Being emotionally and physically available is super important. You guys, I know you guys typically do that as foster parents, and it can be exhausting for you because these kids need a lot. But these kids need attention and comfort and encouragement that maybe they didn't have before. And so those things can be really important when it comes to addressing some of this. Respond, don't react, which is really hard because a lot of times we get into these like loops. If our kids start tantruming or something, we just want to make the situation stop or let them know it's not okay. But our reactions could trigger a child or youth who is already feeling overwhelmed. Again, remember, if you continue this tantrum, you're not going to be able to do this. They're not in that frontal lobe. They're in that survival brain. And so they're not making, decisions. They're not at a place where they can make decisions. So we have to get them through that tantrum and then start in on the consequences once they're kind of back into that prefrontal lobe. But it is hard because they are tantruming and we need them to stop. So when your child is upset, we need to kind of keep our calm and let them know they're safe, and then kind of raise them up to that prefrontal cortex where we can start having those conversations. Again, I know you guys know we don't do physical punishment, but just as I mentioned, because if you have an abused child and you do have physical punishment, that can trigger. Don't take behavior personally. I know our kids sometimes do behavior in a way that is personal, but if we can not take personal or behavior personally, that is helpful. We can allow them to feel their feelings without judgment, trying to help them find words and other acceptable ways of expressing feelings can be helpful. If we can listen and not avoid difficult topics and uncomfortable conversations, that can be really helpful to provide a safety and a safe area for them. Reassuring them it's not their fault. Helping them learn how to relax, even when they are not up there, when they're, just normal. Practicing breathing, listening to calming music. Those things will help them self-regulate later. I'll talk about therapy in a minute, but hopefully their therapist can work with them too. We were talking about, different home styles and parenting styles, but being consistent and predictable is the best. Having a regular routine just provides that safety for them where they're not having to, be hyper vigilant. So being patient, obviously, if you've had kids in your home, you know that sometimes it can take a really long time before we see changes. So everyone heals differently. Um, if we can allow some control and let our kids pick some things, so age appropriate choices, maybe picking dinner one night a week, allowing them to pick their outfits out, even if they don't match, whatever, that gives them a feeling of some control, and then they don't feel so, like they are just in a system where they don't have any choices or control. And encouraging self-esteem, we need our kids to have positive experiences. That's how they recover. That's how they get resilience. So, that's where things like clubs and after school activities and, you know, sports teams come in. Those can be really helpful for those things. Okay, so we do want our kids to be in treatment if they are suffering from, symptoms of trauma. There's a lot of different treatments. Cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of the gold standard. That can work with kids of any ages. Basically, they're going to be talking with their therapist about either traumatic event or just things in their life. And they're going to be talking about thoughts, feelings, and actions, those kind of things. Some anxiety management techniques, and then, like I said, the correlation of inaccurate or distorted thoughts. So that's a good one. Play therapy is super fantastic for younger kids. Sometimes it's hard to find a play therapist who's taking kids, especially if you don't live in a larger area. But like I said, if you have kids and you ever, smaller kids and seen them play, they do reenact a lot of times what's happened. And so a therapist can get a lot of information that way. And so that becomes really helpful. Psychological first aid is essentially if a kid says that something happened or discloses at school, and then that counselor or teacher is trained in psychological first aid to address that there at the school and then kind of figure out a treatment plan later. EMDR can be super helpful as well. I would say with older kids, I don't know if they do it with younger kids. Maybe they do. It combines cognitive behavioral therapy with directed eye movements, but essentially it takes some of those traumatic events that are kind of stored in our short-term memory box and that bother us day to day, and it takes away the emotional content of those memories and kind of puts them more in our long-term memory box. So it can be really helpful. Again, medications. I know we don't like to over-medicate our kids or even medicate them if we can avoid it, but sometimes our kids do need medications in order for these treatments to start working. If they are so dysregulated that they can't start, utilizing these treatments, they might need some medication until they can. And then some specialized interventions would be like if they were utilizing drugs to address their trauma symptoms, they might need some substance abuse. Or if they'd been sexually abused and, they were showing behaviors that were inappropriate, they might need a special therapist who's been trained in sexual abuse. So, if you do end up needing, treatment for a child who's been in care, who's had trauma, you might think about asking, the provider, the therapist, some questions to kind of gauge whether or not they are capable of treating someone with some high needs, some trauma needs. So some of the things that you might ask are you familiar with research about the effects of trauma on children? Can you tell me about your experience working with children and youth who have experienced trauma? And I think, most providers who are trauma-based would be glad to answer some of these questions and give you some ideas. How do you determine whether a child's symptoms may be caused by trauma? And how does a child's history influence your treatment approach? So just kind of thinking about how you want to interact with this therapist and kind of get a good idea of how they could help. I know a lot of times we send our kids to therapy every week, and maybe after, a year or whatever, we're like, what are they even doing in therapy? I don't know that they're doing a lot, or is it helping? And so maybe having some conversations like this, like, what are you going to be working on? What kind of research could help you have an idea of, okay, this is probably not the right provider, or this is a great provider. I'll check in with this person. Because foster kids who have experienced trauma are not, like, we've talked about throughout this presentation, are not the same as maybe their peers who have had a car accident, and that car accident is causing them to go to therapy. They're different kind of traumas, and we need to make sure that their therapists are capable of addressing this. So here's kind of my references. I'm certainly glad to send those to you. Let me see here. If you guys have any questions,